Pack it in! That's not even the right song! Shut it! Oh, shit.
Uh-oh.
Run! Go!
Alright, so I've been playing a bit of Silksong lately because, who hasn't? And it's really quite good, isn't it? It is pretty good. I mean, most of the time. And coming as a surprise to absolutely nobody, Christopher Larkin's created an absolutely superb soundtrack. Face-meltingly, tear-wrenchingly, my God, this game is difficult, but I'll bumble through it with the soundtrack as my emotional support. Superb. So I thought I'd do a quick video on a couple of the tracks that have stood out to me so far. Just dig into them a bit, see what clever tricks and sneaks Larkin's been up to here, and hopefully blow my mind in the process and maybe blow yours as well. You're welcome. I've got to say, I really liked the second one we'll look at today before I started analysing it, but after sort of transcribing it and kind of seeing everything come together, I don't know, I've really fallen in love with that second one. Oh, and hey, here's a pro tip. For some reason the music is really quiet in Silksong, so do yourself a favour and go into the audio settings in the Silksong menu and try turning down the sound volume to maybe like 7 or 8, and then just up the volume of your device to compensate, so that then your music is louder in the mix. It's so quiet by default. I actually thought that the soundtrack was just really kind of ambient with nothing really to it in terms of melody and stuff, but it's just because it's really quiet by default. Not sure what that's about. It doesn't seem like the kind of soundtrack you'd want to sweep under the rug, to be honest, but anyway, little pro tip for you. How's that for value? So the first song we'll look at is the theme from Greymoor. Now, this might be the saddest song I've ever heard in my life, and I'm not actually sure if I'm exaggerating or not there. I can't think of a sadder song off the top of my head, so it really could be. It is unbelievable, and it's beautiful as well, particularly one bit, which we'll get to. So Larkin went all out on making this one ultra solemn. Maybe that's a better word for it than sad. Solemn. Then again, I almost burst into tears pretty much every time I hear it, so, I think sad does count. So it starts out with these really soft, like tremolo violas, with a bass that sort of establishes the root note for us. Tremolo is this technique on stringed instruments. You've probably seen it before. They sort of shake the bow back and forth really quickly, rather than using the usual long, sort of sweeping action. It gives this sort of shaky, or maybe a shimmery sound when played softly, as these violas are. So, we've got E in the bass, and an E and B in the violas. So, alrighty, we're probably in E then, since the root note is most often played in the bass, and B is the 5th in the scale of E, which is a nice, perfect, almost definitive interval. So we're very likely in E. We don't know if it's major or minor yet, because B is in both E major and E minor. But this is a good starting bit of info for us to have, because it gets our ears sort of calibrated to the root note of the key. So that means we know and feel where home base is right away. Everything from here is going to be relative to that root note in our mind, which means it all immediately makes sense musically and gives us the kind of feels that Larkin's aiming for. And my word, the feels go hard. The first chord when the cello comes in, after that short little sort of pre-bar to establish that root note and a bit of atmosphere, actually isn't the root or tonic chord. It's not E, it's actually D, which is the 7 chord in E minor. So that means the little intro bar that establishes the key of E is extra important. Otherwise, we might hear this first D chord and think the song is just in D and this is the root note, because we haven't been calibrated. But as it is, Larkin sets up the tonic first, then hits the D. And it's a little bit unusual to start a song on the 7 chord, so it's sort of an interesting vibe already, maybe a touch unsettling. But because Larkin already established E as the root note, we're also able to straight away recognise this sound as a bit sad or solemn as well. It's nice, it's good stuff. Notice how gradually this cello comes in as well. It's like there's barely enough energy to muster up the note. It's really kind of laboured sounding, and it keeps that style up throughout the melody. These slides between notes. Other bits are played barely loud enough to be perceived. You can just hear the bow brushing along the string. It's like the cello players on their last legs, let alone Greymoor. Of course, it's super slow as well, right about 50 BPM. It's this whole lifeless, solemn vibe. So solemn. Now, I know this might be hard to believe given the topic of my first video on this channel, but I do try not to go too hard picking out every conceivable little detail in a song and interpreting it to represent some grandiose bloody theme or idea, but I actually do think it's worth throwing that lens over this track a little bit because it's a particularly palpable one, I think. Like these sustained viola tremolos that we touched on earlier, they're a good example. They play throughout the entire track and just feel like a mist or a fog draped over the whole thing. Talk about painting a picture. And it's such a sort of static piece. It's not all dynamic. The melody lines generally just step from neighbouring note to neighbouring note. Anytime there's a bigger leap in pitch, the cello often sort of drags itself to the next note with a slide. It really gives a sense of this broken, lifeless husk of a place. Visually, those crooked lampposts and tattered canopies tell pretty much the same story, plus obviously there's that fog. I guess we were right about those viola tremolos. And you could think of those tremolos as representing that perpetual, soul-crushing rainfall as well, I guess. I've just realised that Greymoor is basically the UK. Oh yeah, what's this? The Greymoor map. The bugs who once tended this land have clearly lost their way. Alright, this is getting too real now. So then there's this friggin' B section with the violins and the emotion and just listen. If there isn't some part of you that quietly sobs when those violins come in, then you must be one of these little pilgrim bugs who've been turned. These emotionless husks. To be honest, I don't know quite why it gets me as hard as it does, but damn. Again, these violins do that crescendo thing where they start soft and gain force through the note, which is a really moving way to perform. As for why it's so impactful, I mean, you could point out the contrast in pitch to the cello or the descending pattern in the melody. You could say it represents the gentle fall from grace of a once beautiful land, or maybe the idea that there might yet be a kind of tragic beauty here if you look in the right place. But this might be an example of when music is just made to be beautiful and evoke some emotions that can't really be described in words. I do think that's something Larkin really excels at, writing a sort of purely musical narrative. You know how if you just play a bunch of random notes on a keyboard, even if they're all in the right key, they don't sound sensible or like meaningful. Whereas a good melody seems to tell you something. It has some kind of like narrative to it. It doesn't need words because you can feel it without writing or even imagining any lyrics. It's just an audio story of some kind, purely in the language of music. I think Larkin is one of the best at writing meaningful musical phrases like that say a lot, but purely musically. He's of course incredible at directly representing physical things with music as well, we've seen that already. But he has that kind of mind to just write meaningful music in isolation. Just a really intuitive understanding of music. I'm totally not jealous at all. Talented bastard. And this bit towards the end of the violin phrase is interesting. Have a listen. Now this is where we talk about
modal interchange.
So you might notice that in this little sequence, this note comes as a little bit of a surprise. You might not be quite expecting it. It also happens to sound absolutely beautiful and makes me cry. So that's a normal F, an F natural, as opposed to F sharp. It's actually not in the key of E minor. But it is in your boy's favourite mode, the Phrygian mode. I think I'll make a separate video to explain modes sometime, but for now, if you watch my previous video, you'll remember that modes are scales, just like major and minor, just with a couple of notes different here and there, which gives them a different flavour. The Phrygian mode has a flattened second degree of the scale. In other words, the second note of the scale is just a half step above the root note instead of a whole step. So Phrygian goes E, F, G, and the rest is just the same as the normal natural minor. So what do you know, here we have a scale in E that uses the note F. So Larkin has substituted in the Phrygian mode here instead of using the natural minor. There's
Modal interchange.
all over the Hollow Knight soundtracks, and Christopher Larkin is very good at it. He has a particular style in the way he deploys it too. Very often he'll make the switch to a different mode to create a moment, a deliberate spot that sort of makes your ears perk up a bit, like a clear moment where a new emotion or flavour is dropped in. This Greymoor theme is a good example of it. It's a really interesting flavour that it adds here too. The Phrygian mode is often described as adding darkness or tension, and that does make sense because the half-step interval between the first and the second notes in that mode can cause a bit of dissonance. But being a raging fan of the Phrygian mode, I've always found it to be a bit more versatile than it's given credit for. For some reason in the Greymoor theme, I feel like there's something almost romantic about the sound. Not like a "hey baby" kind of romantic, but I don't know, just an interesting, sort of artistic romantic. I'm not sure. It's an interesting flavour. I'd be interested to hear how that bit comes across to you guys, actually. Again, I don't want to be too silly with like wild interpretations about this stuff, so I'm leaving this one as just adding some nuance and intrigue to the emotion. But hey, I'll tell you one I do have a silly interpretation for, though. I think it's another tremolo viola or violin that sort of drifts in briefly at a few points in the song, maybe with some effects on it to make it sound a bit weird. Now for me that sounds so ghostly that I can't help but think it's intended to represent like the ghostly voices of all the lost souls of Greymoor. It's so haunting, but just like everything else in the track, it's like really beautiful. Alright, moving on. These Greymoor visuals are depressing me. Reminds me of looking out of a UK window. So very different vibe on this one. It's the theme from Shellwood. Super cool area. And for me, it's one of those themes that kind of stand out as being a bit of a highlight of the soundtrack. Bit of a Queen's Gardens kind of wow factor to it. It actually shares some similarities with Queen's Gardens, actually. Similar instruments, similar kind of arpeggiated main bit, even a somewhat similar bit of... No, we're not doing that again. For now. But yeah, similar bit of modal interchange. But this track is definitely more intense. The B section gets you proper locked in. Gives a real sense of danger and sort of epic, heroic struggle. It's so good. So we start out with this kind of arpeggiated harp main theme, which I'm a huge fan of. It runs down the A minor scale, so we're setting the tone right away. And get a load of this viola line, just spamming that E, which is the 5th in A minor. For most of the track, it's actually on A, the root note, but for this first sort of 12 bars, it's on the E. And it might seem like there isn't much to this, like it doesn't achieve all that much, but I think it's actually a really crucial part of the composition. For starters, it adds a layer to the opening section of the song, which is good because it might feel a bit too thin at the start if it was just the harp and those subtle violin sustains over the top. And being on the 5th, it's a nice way to harmonise with pretty much anything the harp is doing without making too bold a statement. But this line also does loads to make the whole thing feel urgent. When you have a line that's just hitting those quavers, or 8th notes, is that what you American folks call them? Whatever they are, you know, those half beat things. Is that what you... Yeah, it really adds pace. It's actually surprising how much pace you do gain just from that. But for me, the best thing about these 8th notes is the way they're accented. Some of them are really heavily emphasised, whereas others are barely played at all. I think that works really well here, because it gives the sense of physical depth and space, and like activity all around you. This track feels really dynamic and like 3D to me. Compare it to Greymoor, which is obviously intended to give a sense of stillness. And then you got this. Feels like there's so much activity, so much life, which obviously really suits Shellwood, which is this sort of verdant undergrowth place with all these nasty bastards all over the place, traps, camouflage stuff. This theme pretty much tells you to keep your wits about you before the game does. And it's so good as well because Larkin's done this all with just clever use of rhythm and emphasis rather than just sticking a shit ton of instruments in all at the same time and risk it feeling bloated or muddy or just too busy. And that is really difficult, by the way. It's famously one of the more difficult hurdles to overcome when you're learning how to make music. You know, get your stuff to sound busy and engaging without just overcrowding the soundstage and making it sound muddy and messy. And here we go, towards the end of the first little go-around of the A section, we get our first lovely moment of
Modal interchange.
I can't resist using it. Alright, but anyway, listen to the switch up. How good is that? Brings in that new, slightly unexpected colour. It's that F sharp there. Because look, here's the A minor scale, because we're in A minor for this piece. No F sharp, just F. So what does have F sharp? Well, F is the 6th degree of the A minor scale. So is there a mode that raises the 6th degree of the scale by half a step? Sure is, the Dorian mode, which we've come across before in the Zelda soundtrack. Its notable feature is kind of that it's a natural minor scale with a raised 6th. So there you go, we've borrowed the Dorian 6th at this point to switch up the tone a bit. But hold on, let's listen to the next bar and see what the bass line does. So that G sharp also isn't in the A minor scale, but it's not in the Dorian mode either. Well, there is something we could use that has a raised 6th and 7th degree compared to the minor. It's just the major. So look, compared with the minor, A major has a raised 3rd, 6th and 7th degree. So while at first this looks like a Dorian modal interchange, it's probably better to just say we're borrowing from the major for the last 2 bars instead, which is still modal interchange, but with the Ionian mode, which is the cool modal name for major. Now, actually, I kind of suspect that Larkin had the Dorian sound in his mind when he wrote this, and then just subbed in the raised 7th in the 2nd bar, because it sounded just so good. So maybe it is a Dorian and then an Ionian interchange, and I only say that because Larkin seems to be a big fan of the Dorian mode, and it's all over the Hollow Knight soundtracks. It's pretty much a theme. But you know, it all amounts to the same thing ultimately. It doesn't matter how you break it down or what you call it. And regardless, it's just absolute cinema for the ear holes. Now, the major key is, of course, a more bright and uplifting scale. And as we talked about in my previous video, the Dorian raised 6th can be described as bringing a touch of light to the otherwise dark minor scale. So you could definitely see this little choice in the Shellwood theme as representing something bright or beautiful about the scene. There's definitely beauty in the environment of this area, that's for sure, but for me personally, the overall effect in this particular case just kind of adds some intrigue to the piece. I'm just going by feels on that, it's subjective, isn't it? But that fits really well because it's such a mysterious kind of place. Still, the way this little tone shift lands is pretty subjective, I think, so it might hit you a bit differently. I guess that's just another cool feature of creative songwriting. What did you think I was going to say? Oh, you thought I was going to say...
Modal interchange.
For the second run through this main theme, we get an oboe blazing in with a sweet little melody. I'm a huge fan of the oboe. I think it's a gorgeous sounding instrument. Anyway, it links up with the flute that comes in during that B section. Now speaking of the B section, let's have a go on it because it's my favourite bit. This is where it gets crazy intense. That is the absolute business, isn't it? I absolutely love it. Christopher Larkin is so good at using those string swells, it's crazy. And what makes these chords for me is that they hit the 2nd degree of the scale really emphatically, puts it right on the top of the voicing. So this first one, when you combine the bass, the viola swells and the harp, or actually that harp might now be a harpsichord on this bit. It's got a bit of a sort of keyboardy harpsichordy vibe about it, I'm not too sure. But anyway, when you've got that alternating between the root note A and the 5th E, combined with everything else, you get a suspended chord, A sus2. Now, we came across suspended chords in my previous video, so you might remember that suspended chords leave out the 3rd degree of the scale in contrast to more typical chords which use the root, the 3rd and the 5th. But instead, in a sus chord, you have the root note, no 3rd, you do have the 5th, and then you add the 2nd degree of the scale, typically on the top there. Now without the 3rd, you can't tell if the chord is major or minor, so the mood is a bit ambiguous. There's tension because the chord doesn't feel resolved. It's a big part of why this section of the track feels so friggin' dramatic. And then that 2nd in the viola stays there for the next chord as well. It's always nice when the kind of defining note in a chord stays right where it is for the next new chord and then gets kind of recontextualized because of its new relative function in the new chord. So for example here, we start with our A sus2 chord, so this B is obviously functioning as the suspended 2nd. But for the next chord, the bass moves to C, so what was the 2nd degree of the scale just now has stayed exactly where it was on the B, but now it's the 7th in a C major 7 chord. It just sounds so good to have that continuity running through two chords, and especially when it's the B, which is the second degree of the key signature. A lot of songs lean on that second degree of the scale for their melodies because it sounds just so good, so dramatic. It became really common in pop songs at some point. I guess everybody just rediscovered the joyous unresolvedness of hammering the second degree of the scale over a root chord. Beautiful, if a little bit overused, but we don't mind. And then we get this next section where a flute hops in with a great little melody that incorporates some more. Now again, this is an example of the interchange creating a moment that deliberately stands out. This one's really emphasized. You can see this melody stepping very deliberately down the minor scale, G, F, E, before hopping back up to that F sharp. So it's really clear in our mind that this note is in some way out of step with the key. Even if you're not super into music theory and consciously kind of analysing this, the sound is going to make some kind of statement still. A change of flavour, something unexpected. We talked earlier about how intriguing an area Shellwood is. Things are often not quite as they seem here. Like, check this little shitter out pretending to be a stick. So it's such a cool touch to drop that conspicuous bit of Dorian flavour in again, for the intrigue. And there's no sign of the raised 7th degree this time, so this is fully evoking the Dorian sound, and it suits the environment perfectly. So those chords kind of follow this rising pattern to build up tension, and then to finish up the B section, before looping back to the start, we get the flute and the oboe kind of teaming up on the melody. It's this awesome harmonised call and response thing. So well done. The flute and oboe are such sort of pretty instruments and have such an elegant kind of floaty melody line here. Plus that little Dorian moment, it always gives me the image of Hornet herself kind of darting and pirouetting over all the hazards and nastiness below. That call and response bit almost suggests a kind of artistic, dance-like combat with some elusive little Shellwood shitbag that's all fun and games until it explodes into a cloud of toxic bullshit or whatever that kills you. Because everything kills you in this game. Even the benches kill you. I'm gonna kill this game! What a couple of tunes those are. Killer tunes! How apt. And while I've been editing this video, I've already come across a couple of other absolute bangers in the soundtrack, so maybe I'll do another video down the line. I can't resist, to be honest. Let me know if there are any good ones you think we should have a look at. But until then, I'll see you in a bit.